The sun beats down relentlessly on a vast construction site, a chaotic symphony of creaking machinery, screaming foremen, and the constant beeping of reversing trucks. The air trembles with heat and dust. James, a laborer with years of experience etched on his face and robust arms, works on the steel structure of a new building. He is a strong man, confident in his surroundings. But in an instant, confidence turns to pure terror. A scream cuts through the background noise. James, who was maneuvering a heavy beam with a colleague, seems to lose his balance. His foot slips on an uneven surface. His arms flail in the air. He falls backward, slamming hard into the wooden slats of a scaffold before hitting the dirt floor with a dull, horrific thud. The silence that follows is more frightening than the noise. Colleagues rush forward. The supervisor grabs the radio, his voice urgent, calling for help. The scene is one of pure chaos and genuine concern. This fall, captured in vivid detail by the construction site security camera, is the triggering event. It's the seed for a workers' compensation claim that will seek hundreds of thousands of dollars. The stage is set. The transition from the sunny chaos of the construction site to the dim light of an apartment is abrupt. James is now a shadow of his once confident self. He moves with exaggerated caution, a low groan escaping his lips whenever he repositions himself on the couch. His life has become a cycle of doctor's appointments. In cold, fluorescent-lit examination rooms, he becomes a consummate actor. He describes excruciating back pain radiating down his leg, unbearable numbness, and sleepless nights. His performance is impeccable. The sweat on his forehead during a physical exam. His voice trembles as he details his inability to play with his young children. The doctors, initially skeptical due to the lack of clear imaging evidence, are slowly convinced by the consistency of his account and his apparent genuine anguish. The forms are filled out. The reports, though cautious, indicate temporary total disability. The insurance company checks begin to flow into his account, a river of money that rewards his performance of pain. He becomes a willing prisoner of his own apartment, which to him at the time, seems a small price to pay. If this story is touching you, comment below where you're watching from and what time it is there, because the truth machine is about to be turned on, and it spares no one. James's days became a meticulous choreography of disability. Every movement was calculated, every moan timed to be heard by his wife or occasional visitors. His life was now a stage and he was the protagonist of a medical tragedy. The walls of his apartment seemed to close in around him, but to him, they were the walls of a fort protecting his secret. His cell phone cameras were full of photos of MRI scans and prescriptions for painkillers, which he strategically shared in family groups to solidify his narrative. He studied online videos of people with real chronic pain, perfecting their body language of suffering. Financial compensation was regular, a constant reminder that his plan was working. He was no longer James the worker. He was James the injured, a fragile figure who inspired pity and, most importantly, credibility. The persona was so convincing that, at times, even he began to believe in his own pain, a dangerous phenomenon that only deepened his web of lies. Meanwhile, in the insurance company's cold storage servers, a very different system was at work. It wasn't driven by emotion or imagination but by pure logic. The doubt algorithm was fraud detection software that crunched thousands of data points in milliseconds. It analyzed patterns. And James's pattern began to flash yellow. First, it was the discrepancy between his accident report, a fall from a significant height, and the relative scarcity of objective injuries on his initial imaging scans. Then it was the frequency and near-perfect timing of his doctor's appointments, always preceding his benefits renewal. The algorithm realized that all his pain reports were subjective, based solely on his own description, with no objective measure of disability. No doctor had actually viewed unable to move, they just listened to him to say that he was incapable. A red flag. A fraud analyst, a woman named Anya, received the alert. Her job was to make sense of the algorithm's signals. She opened James's digital file, a virtual folder filled with PDFs, reports, and evidence notes. The algorithm proved nothing, but it pointed in a direction. It was a beacon in the fog, and Anya began navigating in its direction. The investigation, until then dormant, was officially reopened. The hunt was on. Anya's investigation didn't begin with grandiose suspicions, but with a meticulous review of a digital paper trail. She printed out the algorithm-generated timeline and posted it on a whiteboard. On one side were James's medical records, 10-tenths pain, unable to drive, severe numbness. On the other, the hard data, imaging reports showing only mild degeneration consistent with his age, records that he renewed his driver's license after the accident, and, the most interesting piece, an online purchase record for a high-performance treadmill, delivered to his address 6 weeks after the fall. A strange purchase for a man who claimed he couldn't stand for more than 5 minutes. The algorithm sniffed out the inconsistency and Anya followed suit. She didn't confront James. Instead, she issued a discreet surveillance authorization. The passive phase was over. The active phase, that of silent observation, was about to begin. The truth machine, slow and relentless, began to move toward him. The authorization gave rise to a professional and spooky surveillance operation. Private investigators specializing in insurance took over the case. They weren't movie characters. They were methodical and patient. They mapped James's routine from an unmarked car and a vacant rented apartment overlooking his living room window. In the early days, observation corroborated his claim. He was rarely seen, and when he was, he limped visibly as he fetched the newspaper from the door or took out the trash. He was careful. But investigators were paid to be more patient than the fraudster. And then, one Saturday morning, their patience was rewarded. The garage door opened. James stepped out without his usual crutch. He looked around quickly, almost reflexively. And then he stretched his arms toward the sky in a long, carefree arc, like someone who has just woken up and stretched. There was no hesitation. There was no pain. Just the easy, fluid movement of a healthy body. The investigators exchanged glances. They knew it was only a matter of time. The trap was set and irrefutable evidence was on its way. The investigators' patience was finally rewarded on the 10th day of surveillance. It was a sunny Saturday and the neighborhood was quiet. Around 11 in the morning, James's garage door opened. He didn't emerge limping. He emerged with restrained energy, wearing gym clothes and new sneakers. In the minutes that followed, investigators, using high-definition telephoto lenses, captured a sequence of images that would completely demolish James's deception. First, he went to the garage and, without any visible effort, carried the treadmill he had purchased online, the same treadmill his medical report said he couldn't use, to the middle of the garage. He plugged it in. Then he didn't just walk on it. He began a vigorous jog, his face focused, sweat dripping from his forehead after a few minutes. There was no sign of lower back pain, no limp, none of the debilitating limitations he described under oath. The irrefutable evidence was being recorded in high definition, each frame a silent indictment. But the investigators didn't stop there. Taking advantage of James's distraction, one of the agents, using a discreet and silent drone, operated within all legal guidelines, managed to position the camera to get a clear view of the backyard. There, partially hidden behind a shed, was James's secret project, a miniature construction site. He was building a large wooden cabin. Stacks of boards, bags of cement and professional tools were scattered everywhere. The footage showed James, after his run, heading straight to the backyard, grabbing a chainsaw and cutting wooden beams with precision and force, his body bending and twisting without a hint of discomfort. He carried heavy boards on his shoulders, mixed concrete in a cement mixer, and hammered nails with a vigor that would make any healthy construction worker sweat. The contradiction between the man on screen and the invalid in the medical records was stark, shocking, and, to the insurance company, unquestionably criminal. They weren't just a moment's carelessness. They had a complete documentary of their fraud. The invitation to a sworn deposition session arrived in the mail. To James, it seemed like a routine formality, a necessary step to keep the benefits flowing. He mentally rehearsed his performance. The weak voice, the careful movements, the expression of chronic pain. He didn't know he was walking into a minefield the insurance company had meticulously prepared. The room was cold and impersonal, furnished with a long table and uncomfortable chairs. On one side sat James and his lawyer. On the other, the insurance company's lawyer, Anya, and a stenographer. The air was charged with a formality bordering on hostility. The testimony began routinely. Anya asked basic questions about the accident, his symptoms, and his limitations. James immersed himself in his role, describing in vivid detail his life of suffering and dependence. His performance was convincing, even moving. Then the tone changed. Anya, with a calmness that was more menacing than any rudeness, asked a seemingly innocent question. "Mr. James, could you describe your current daily activities? From the moment you wake up." James confidently detailed his limited existence. Getting up with difficulty, spending the day on the couch, watching television, total dependence on his wife for simple tasks. "Do you do any physical activity? Walking perhaps?" she asked, her voice as soft as a razor's edge. "Absolutely not," James replied with dramatic conviction. I can't walk to the end of the street without excruciating pain. My life is confined to my home. It was the answer she'd been waiting for. Anya paused dramatically, looked at the stenographer and said, "I would like, with the officer's permission, to play a brief video segment for clarification." A monitor clicked on. The room fell silent. Then the images began to swirl. There was James, not the frail man he just testified to, but vibrant and strong, running on his treadmill, sawing wood and carrying bags of cement. The perjury trap snapped shut. The transformation in the room was palpable. The color drained from James's face. His attorney cringed in his chair. The silence that followed the video was more thunderous than any scream. Anya then asked the simplest and most devastating question. "Mr. James, could you explain the discrepancy between your sworn testimony and the footage we just saw?" The web of lies collapsed completely. James was unable to answer. His charade was over. The silence in the deposition room was so heavy you could hear the low hum of the monitor. James offered no explanation. He couldn't. His performance had been demolished not by words, but by irrefutable visuals. His ashen-faced attorney managed only no further questions before gathering up his documents with trembling hands. The deposition was over. The case was no longer about a disputed injury, now it was about perjury and deliberate fraud. The file, now swelled with the transcript of the disaster and the damning video, was forwarded to the final stage, the hearing before the judge. The Workers' Compensation Board's courtroom wasn't a criminal courtroom, but it carried the same weight of authority. Dark wood, the state seal on the wall, the American flag. And in the center, elevated on a platform, sat the judge. A middle-aged man with glasses and an expression that was a study in weary neutrality. He didn't look angry, he looked deeply disappointed, which was infinitely worse. Attorney Anya presented the case with the precision of a surgeon. She didn't need emotion. She guided the judge through the journey. The initial accident, the benefits, the inconsistencies detected by the algorithm, the surveillance, and finally, the climax of the testimony. The video was played once more. In the solemn atmosphere of the courtroom, each frame was a blow. The judge's desk was almost tangible. His eyes, behind the lenses, scanned every line of the transcript. He compared James's specific statements of total incapacity with the images of vigor and strength. He observed James's body language of quiet desperation throughout the hearing. The judge asked no questions. He simply absorbed. His pen occasionally jotted something down on a pad, the sound of the nib scraping against the paper echoing in the stillness. He was weighing each fragment of evidence, not with anger, but with methodical, ruthless precision. The law was a scale, and he was placing every ounce of James's lie in the correct pan. The feeling in the room was not one of tension over Wythe would be unmasked, but about how deep the final verdict would fall. The sentence wouldn't just be a punishment, it would be an existential reckoning for James. James's lawyer tried one last desperate argument. His once confident voice sounded weak and technical in the quiet room. "Your Honor, I ask that you consider the context. My client may have had a good morning. A single day of relief amid months of agony. The images show a moment of exception, not the rule. He may have exacerbated his condition precisely by exerting himself that day." He tried to argue that the surveillance was intrusive and that the testimony was a setup. But every word rang hollow, a pathetic attempt to glue together the shards of a broken mirror. It was then that the judge asked his only question. His voice was calm, low, but it cut through the air like a blade. "Attorney," he began, looking over his glasses directly at the lawyer, completely ignoring James. "Your client is not on trial for having a good morning. He is on trial for having sworn to tell the truth, the complete truth, and nothing but the truth, and then having described, under oath, a life of utter incapacity. Minutes after that oath, he was presented with visual evidence that directly and completely contradicted every word he had said. The issue before this court is not about an injury. It is about perjury. It is about a calculated and meticulous fraud against the system. Do you have any explanation for that specific discrepancy?" The silence that followed was the most eloquent answer. James's lawyer opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He simply shook his head and sat down, defeated. The trap was sprung. The judge gave a barely perceptible nod to lawyer Anya, indicating he had heard enough. He then asked James to stand. The man complied, his shoulders now hunched not from feigned pain, but from the crushing weight of guilt and impending consequences. The judge did not shout. He did not reprimand. His sentence was delivered with a coldness that was more frightening than any outburst of anger. Based on the overwhelming evidence presented, the judge declared, I find that plaintiff James committed bad faith workers' compensation fraud and perjury. He then proceeded to list the consequences, each one sounding like a blow. The claim for compensation is dismissed in its entirety. Plaintiff will be ordered to repay all wrongfully received benefits, with compounded interest. I further impose the maximum civil penalty permitted by law for insurance fraud. This case will be referred to the district attorney for consideration of criminal charges of large-scale insurance fraud and perjury. Each word was a nail in the coffin of his life as he knew it. The debt would be unpayable. The criminal stain permanent. The hammer of justice had not just fallen, it had completely crushed the farce. The sound of the gavel echoed through the courtroom not like a thunderous crash, but like the final closing of a heavy book. The judge's verdict wasn't a sentence, it was a dissolution. It dissolved James's carefully constructed persona, dissolved his ill-gotten gains, and dissolved any facade of innocence that might still linger in the air. He didn't leave that room a man. He left as a case study, an example to be cited in insurance procedure manuals. The civil fine alone was a financial prison sentence, a debt he would likely carry for the rest of his life. And the looming threat of criminal proceedings hung over him like a dark cloud, promising a future of courtrooms, legal fees, and the potential loss of his freedom. The real downfall didn't happen on the construction site that day, it happened years later in that silent room, when the weight of his own lies finally came crashing down on him. The true emotional twist of this story is not the fraud itself, but the complete and utter humiliation that follows being unmasked by an impartial authority. It is poetic justice to have your boldest lie, the claim of total incapacity, destroyed by the public display of your total capacity. The judge in this narrative is more than an enforcer of the law. He is the restorer of order. He ensures that the system, sometimes slow and bureaucratic, still has sharp teeth. He ensures that compassion, a precious resource meant for those truly in need, is not stolen by those who exploit it with greed and selfishness. The sense of justice comes not just from punishment, but from the restoration of balance. Every dollar returned is a resource that can help a legitimate worker. Every fraudster exposed strengthens the integrity of a system on which we all depend. This story serves as a chilling warning. A warning that no plan is perfect, that no performance is flawless enough to fool everyone all the time. Silent witnesses are always watching, whether through the lens of a camera, in the consciousness of a colleague, or in the meticulous analysis of an investigator. The search for truth may be slow, but it is inevitable. And when it arrives, represented by the austere figure of the judge, it does not negotiate. It simply executes. What about you, on the other side of the screen? Have you ever wondered how far you'd go for an advantage? Have you ever seen someone get away with lying and wondered if the game is worth the candle? James's story is the answer. Comment below. Do you think the punishment was too harsh, or was it exactly what he deserved? Where are you watching this justice being served?